Hello, and welcome back to Old Soul Podcast. My name is Bree, that's spelled B-R-E-I. Thank you so much. Today's film commentary is going to be about the film Psycho. It was released in 1960 with a rating of rated R, and it has a runtime of 1 hour and 49 minutes. The director is the Alfred Hitchcock. If you know, you know. And I'm just going to do my usual commentary over this film. We're going all the way back to 1960 in this episode, so I hope you enjoy. Basically, when I was watching this film, and usually as I watch the films, I go in and I do some notes, and then by the end I have sort of a conclusion, which the film sort of wrapped up very well for me in answering any questions that I had, just in the way that it ended. And obviously when I do my commentaries, I do spoilers, so if you have not seen this film, or you haven't watched it in a while and you kind of want to go back and watch it before listening to this, remember that I always talk about spoilers and I will give everything away. It's really hard to talk about a film without actually talking about the details and the, shocking revelations and the ambiguity of film. So I'm going to talk about it. So something that came up in the first theme is that, and it's not really a theme. Well, I guess when I start talking about it, it'll make sense. So our main character, Marion Crane is our main character, and she is interesting, and I think this brings in the theme. Also, the film has a very distinctive 2 parts that work very well in a way that's cohesive, but you can feel the shift in the film after our main character, Mariom, is no longer with us. So Mariom is basically this clerk at, I believe, this sort of real estate office or something of the sort, because we get a snapshot of her at her work for a very short amount of time where this rich guy comes in, his daughter's getting married, and he's like, throws $40,000 in cash, and he's like, yeah, my daughter's getting married, and the only way to make sure that they stay happy or she stays happy is to make sure that I set her up for success. And I have money, and I never throw money down unless I have an immediate next step amount of money to replace it. So he's bragging and also flirting very pushily at Mariom, and Mariom's just giving him really nothing but the common, yeah, okay. And her boss is kind of talking to her like, hey, that's a lot of money, make sure to put that in the bank. And she has a headache, she says, and she ends up going home early, and that leads to her ultimately stealing the $40,000, sorry, and basically deciding that she's going to start her life over. And then before she went to work and had this whole conversation with these men and another one of her coworkers, she was with her lover, Sam. So her lover slash boyfriend, Sam, works, he owns his own, I don't know if he owns this like store or if he's just like a head manager, but basically he's paying alimony to his ex-wife, so he's a divorcee, and he is in a physical intimate relationship with Mariom, and they do seem to love each other, but he wants to be able to provide a certain lifestyle for her as a man, I suppose it seems like, and she seems like she doesn't really care about that, and she knows that he's not going to go and get married anytime soon because of his last marriage. She's never been married. So basically they're just in different parts of their life and they've experienced different things. I don't know how much older he is than her, but they seem to really care about each other and love each other, but it's just not working. They're having to meet up at these cheap hotels and sneak around. It's the 1960s. It's not really the greatest look for women to be at hotels with men. He's not married and he's not in a relationship with anyone except her, so there shouldn't really be any issue with it. But again, this is the 1960s. Women were judged. You're a whore. That's basically literally your skirt's too short, stuff like that. The bullshit, of course. So anyway, that's what's going on before she goes to work and decides that she's going to steal the $40,000 and start over. Which it definitely seemed like a spur-of-the-moment thing, and clearly the thing that was missing in both of their lives was money that could have made their life a lot better, and so she takes this opportunity, which makes her a thief, no joke, there, and you see this whole sequence of this cop stopping her. Basically, she was already pulled over, and I think she had taken a nap, and the cop's asking her all these questions, and he thinks she's acting strange, because she kind of is, and she's making it seem like she's just a normal person on some normal trip, and he follows her, which is super creepy, because he doesn't really have any real proof that she's doing anything wrong, so, that kind of creeps me out. Even though he didn't know that, right? He suspected it, but he had no proof, so it sort of feels like he's stalking her. She goes to this car dealership to try to switch out her tags in her car, and the cop's following her there. She ends up getting what she needs, but the car salesman is really kind of thinking she's sketchy, even says, like, oh, I don't want to say that you're up to no good, blah, 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 but he's insinuating it. She gets a car. She pays $700 cash from the $40,000 that she had. And ultimately, she ends up at Bates Motel, which is owned basically by Norman Bates, and he's the one who's running the shindig. And when I'm going back to the theme, I just feel like Mariom is really interesting as a character, and I don't know how intentional it is, if Alfred Hitchcock wanted to add her as this sort of virgin whore dichotomy that sometimes happens in sort of horror films. I would consider this film a psychological thriller, not so much a horror film, but I don't know what this would have been considered in terms of genre in the 1960s, especially with a rated R rating. When I've seen much worse films, this probably would have been rated at like PG-13 in 2023. So those things really matter, and I know back then ratings really could make or break, you know, who you can show this to, who you can't, which happens now too, but it was a little more technical back then when actors were set with certain studios and had contracts. It's a whole thing. Maybe one day I'll do a video about like the big five, and that will be really interesting to talk about. But anyway, back to this. I feel like Mariom was a theme on her own as a character, because she had a lover, but she wasn't married, and she stole $40,000 from her job and got caught, in her car cruising around after she lied to her boss and said she had a headache, which at the time I didn't know if she was being honest about that, but then you kind of figured no, when she's sort of smirking to herself and thinking about how everyone's going to be talking about her and how she kind of got one over on that really creepy dude that was flirting with her, and how women are usually put in this box of purity and innocence, and how she does fall into the category of virgin whore. Unfortunately, that's how women are ultimately categorized in real life, even in today's world. But back then, when you have horror films, women are put in the category of she's a virgin, she's like the highest of high, angel-like, or she's a whore, she's a devil, she's a womanizer, she's a seductress, she's a black widow sort of thing. And I think it's interesting because of the way that she ultimately dies in the film, that I feel like if we could see another female character who was the opposite of Mariom, would she have died in the way that she died? Who knows? Maybe I'm reaching there, but I just think it's interesting how films tend to punish women who aren't a certain way. And why couldn't we see her succeed? Why couldn't we see her scrabble a little more with Norman? I feel like if she had expected it, she had seen that Norman was a little off, which I think she suspected, but I think she saw as sort of this nice, awkward guy who's, feeding me and being kind and just doing his job, and he has his old, poor, elderly mom that he's taking care of, and, things like that. And this also ties into, and I'll get more into it probably in the next thing that I talk about, but once she arrives at Bates Motel, she gets checked in. You can see Norman putting on that charm that he does. He seems like a normal guy, whatever. She gets her room. She's starting to get comfortable. She's starting to find ways to hide the money secretly. Anything she writes down, she rips up so that no one can find it. I think she tries to flush that. She has dinner with Norman, but only after hearing Norman fight with his mother, and we hear the mother's voice, and we only ever see her shadow in the window, a wig here and there. But we see and hear, well, we don't really see them fighting. We hear them fighting, and we're in the perspective of Mariom, and they're fighting about her, And Norman's sort of like, oh, can she come over and eat? And the mom's like, no. Basically, it seems like the mom's being like, oh, you're not letting that woman here and blah, blah, blah. Almost like she's insinuating like she's not a good enough woman because of what she assumes of Mariom. And so Norman's fighting and Mariom heard it, and Norman comes back and they have a whole discussion about taxidermy because Norman has this sort of hobby of stuffing dead animals. There's a lot of birds around. And you can sort of see his mask slipping a little bit. And he goes from nice guy, charming, to a little bit odd, a little bit off kilter, very defensive of his mother, even though Mariam's response to hearing that offbeat encounter is kind of normal, and she's being very respectful and understanding. And I mean, she doesn't really have the power in this situation because, you know, she's in the middle of nowhere. She doesn't really know where she is. She just got back from driving away from a cop in a rainstorm. She's basically going to be wanted as soon as everyone puts two and two together. And that's really, it puts her in a vulnerable position. And you can sort of see or feel that Norman is probably attracted to her, and this is something that comes into play that I have questions about later in the next sort of breakdown that I have about what I think about Norman's character. But I just wanted to talk about this as a theme, and that I think there is something with sexuality, virgin whore dichotomy, Mariom not being the stereotypical woman for the 1960s, but her being very stereotypical in her beauty. And just the way that she holds herself and she lives is not very normal, right? Or social norm standards. And so when they finish their discussion, she finishes eating after Norman offered up food because he didn't want her to go back and have to drive in the storm, or at least that's what he made it seem like. He seemed like he was being a gentleman at the time. She goes back into her room. You can see that Norman has a peephole where he can sort of see what's going on, which is really creepy and gives me the biggest ick ever, but also gives that sort of, I don't want to say voyeurism, but it sort of has that vibe. And anyway, we see her getting undressed, about to take a shower, again putting the money up in the newspaper or whatever, and then we have this scene where she gets murdered by supposedly Norman's mother, because we only see a wig, and she dies in the shower. And I'm going to come back to that scene because that's the most iconic scene, most well-known scene ever in Psycho. And I'm going to break that down as to why it's my favorite scene, one of my favorite scenes. So I'm not going to get into detail here, but ultimately I'm telling you this because Mariom dies, and she's killed brutally by being stabbed several times. So yeah, and then we off scene again hear Norman yelling at his mom. He realizes that his mother has killed someone because she didn't like her, whatever. Then we see Norman go clean up the crime scene and push Mariam's dead body that's in the trunk of her car that Norman took and put into this sort of swampy, muddy area so that no one could see the evidence. So again, at this point, we're realizing Norman isn't really who he says he is. As he's watching the car sink in there, he's smiling, sort of smirking, which just goes to show that he, even though he didn't, at this point we assume, kill her, he's still aiding and abetting, and he's still covering up for his mother, so he can't be that great of a guy. And it would be one thing for him covering up, that's still terrible, he should totally have repercussions for that, but it's his smirk that really puts the nail in the coffin, like, no, this dude's fucking crazy. Yeah, he's fucking crazy. Okay, so Mariam's gone, and any evidence of her is basically gone except for a few things that come into play in the second half of the film where, you know, her signature's there, but she uses a different name when she checked in, and evidence of her being there when Norman has to sort of backtrack and too many people are asking questions. Okay, so the second part is just sort of a running flow of my thoughts about Norman. But ultimately, I just broke down sort of what I was assuming as we went on. And I've seen this movie before, so I obviously knew certain things. And I'm going to give a few spoilers in a minute. But the personalities of Norman and Mother and how they combine, you know, who gets harmed by this combination and what probably triggered this situation and how we ultimately come to a conclusion eventually. So, Norman's strange obsession with women, and ultimately, I feel like the obsession isn't just with women. So he doesn't just end up killing women, even though he killed Mariom. He does end up killing another person who I think was a detective or some sort of cop. He ends up killing a man when he gets too close. But I feel like the way that he killed Mariom and the way that he killed that man are very different. And so that's why I'm tying in sexuality. Anything that breaks his connection with Mother, someone's threatening Mother, or someone could replace Mother, or he starts to like someone more than Mother, it becomes an issue and thus becomes a trigger. So the way that he kills the detective, which happens soon after he kills Mariom, is also a stabbing, which is still very personal. But maybe it's because he couldn't get his hands on other types of weapons. But stabbing is very personal. But this guy, really pushes it. And I think he kills this man because Norman feels like he's in a corner and it happens in his space where he's about to be found out. Whereas when he kills Mariom, she's very vulnerable. She's taking a shower. She was brutally attacked. He's going into her space, sort of her space, even though he owns the property, right? And he is getting her off guard. So I do feel like the killings are a sign of the differences in why he's killing people. And I do think that he does prey on women in a way that's different because he's sexually attracted to them, so on and so forth, it seems. So there's clearly a mental illness going on with Norman Bates. And it seems to be multiple personality disorder, but there's probably a more specific diagnosis that people would use nowadays versus the 1960s. And quickly we sort of see that even before we realize that Norman and Mother are the same person, thus making Norman the killer, not Mother, Hitchcock never shows us Mother's face. Again, he only shows us shadows and wigs until we find out that it's Norman dressed up as his mother, and we find out the secret of what's going on with him mentally. He believes that he is Norman and Mother, but Mother's personality is sort of starting to take over the Norman personality. And there's a lot of triggers for that. It seems that he has a very codependent relationship on his mother. And his mother's dead, by the way. She's not alive. So he takes on this personality of Mother as if she's never gone. She never died. Nothing ever happened. And maybe I'm wondering, she was abusive, or they were just so connected that he just doesn't know what else to do with his mom. Sort of like a mama's boy who never grows up. Like he can't do anything without his mom. And to a certain extent, that is very unhealthy. He had a father who died, and supposedly that was really tragic, and I don't know that they ever got into that. But I think maybe his dad's death was a trigger to this disorder. Maybe, possibly. And maybe Norman was always a bad person, but fantastic at hiding it. So maybe he had signs as a kid, and his mom just kind of ignored it. That's also a possibility. It's the 1960s, so I don't know that they would want to be very loud about him being a psycho in 1960s. I mean, I'm sure they put you away, and mental health is just not as understood now as it was, back then as it is now. And so ultimately, we do find out that at some point, Norman is the person who killed his mother. He ends up admitting it. And the thing that triggered him killing his mother was that he felt jealous after she had taken on a lover and he felt like he was being replaced. So more details as to maybe the dad's death was the trigger, and he had that multiple personality disorder before. It just wasn't Mother because Mother was still alive. Then once she died, he killed her. He became obsessive, possessive of her, that codependent relationship that probably started at childhood, mixed with anything he had issues with as a kid. There's so much to flesh through. I'm just throwing stuff out there. He felt that he was being replaced. He also dug up his mother's body after she died from the grave because he was obsessed. Who was he without his mother? So, again, we find out that Norman dug up his mother's body and just like preserved it so that she could always be with him and he could talk in her voice and pretend that she was still alive. But really, it was him dressing up as her and so on and so forth. It's really, really sick. And yeah, yikes. And so, yeah, at first I wondered when we got the reveal that Mother was dead, whose body or whatever, what were we seeing in the window? And it made me wonder, how many people has he killed? But then when we find out he just dug up her body, it made me think less that he had been killing for a while. Maybe Mariom was a trigger for him in the killings, and that was his first killing. Or, well, it wasn't his first killing because he killed his mom and he killed her lover. But maybe this was the first time, someone came to his motel, it was a stranger, and he killed them versus, like, knowing their routine and stuff like that. So, I don't know. It still makes me wonder how many people he's killed. Because he's in such an isolated space, and he's such an oddball. I don't know. And he's not well. I don't want to use the term crazy or insane because I feel like it's insensitive. But also, we can acknowledge that him having a mental disorder does not give him the ability to kill people, and thus he needs to be punished. And he should not get off scot-free because of that, because he has a mental illness. He should have to pay for what he did to people, regardless. But we do also have to consider the mental illness and understanding why this led to this and why this is an issue. Yeah. And so I feel like Norman is in this constant state of debating himself when fighting against Mother's voice, the voice that he puts on and has in his head and other people hear and see, but they don't really physically interact with Mother because she doesn't exist because Norman is Mother. And it's intense when you realize his mom's dead because it makes it more scary. It's like this whole time you were believing that Mother was this sort of omnipresent, villainous killer who was being protected by her son, who was super codependent and also probably just as damaged as her, but you could sort of get that scenario. But now when you realize that Norman is Mother, it makes it extra creepy, less ambiguous, because obviously by the point when you're watching the film, you're going to see it in a sequence, whereas right now I'm just telling you breakdowns of my topics. It's really scary. It's so scary. Okay. Thinking about it in that way, when you know all the real secrets. Norman believes that he's one as mother and son. Anyone that gets in the way of that is a threat, which we see very quickly with the stabbings. Scary, scary, scary. The music playing, right? There may be some underlying sexuality issues, which I already talked about, but just something I noted. It's really odd how he only kills his mother in the wig, etc., not as Norman. So, yeah, that's something else I noticed when I was making these notes. Well, I think I get it now. I think Mother is the personality that's sort of taking over Norman's brain to where he's no longer going to be Norman Bates. He's just going to be Mother. And he only kills as Mother. It's still Norman, but he dresses up as Mother. He has that voice of Mother. So why does he never kill as Norman? Why doesn't he do that? And I think when we find the ending, it's because that personality is the killer, but not Norman. But Norman is still the one aiding and abetting, and Norman is all these people. But when I say Mother and Norman sees them as separate people because that's how his mind works, right? That's really interesting. That's something I noticed. It has the audience convinced that Norman is trying to protect his mom, and she's the villain, but obviously we find out that it's not just enabling, aiding, and abetting. It is Norman. He is Mother. He is the killer. He is the villain. So really interesting stuff there, especially for this older film. I mean, old film just has so much that you can learn from it. It's so interesting. And it makes so much sense as to why Hitchcock was so popular, although he did some questionable things to his actors, which maybe I'll get into one day, but not today. That's a story for another time. And it needs to be mentioned, but another time. So, next topic. breaks into who we know the characters to be. So another, I guess the final and third theme that I'm noticing with the film is that there's this constant battle of who we think people are based on their habits, their routines, their words, their actions, who they perform as, and who they actually are when no one's looking or they think no one's looking, behind closed doors, in their head. And there's this constant thing and theme of who are they and who are they really? So obviously we see that with Norman constantly. We're constantly on edge. We're constantly wondering what's going to happen. Constant, constant, constant. Never a moment in the film where I'm not questioning Norman, ever. Mariom, it's sort of something that happens midway, sort of after she meets her lover Sam. Who is Mariom? Why is she stealing all of a sudden? Why is she on the run? Who is she? Who is she trying to be? Does she want to be a wife that bad? Or does she just want something new? Does she see Sam as someone she really wants to marry, or is that just what she's saying? Who is Mariom really? And then what does everyone else think? You know, no one really suspects Norman. He's just that hermit who runs that hotel or motel. And the sister being like, you know, the sister who is the sister to Mariom, by the way. And okay, I'm gonna say Lila is probably the name. So Lila is Mariom's sister, and we'll get into that soon. But so who does Lila, Sam, the policeman, who do they think Mariom is, and who do they think Norman is, based off of the examples and the past interactions that they've had with him? And most of the time, they don't suspect anything. And I think the only time where that is challenged and cracked is when the detectives and the cops are basically interrogating them like, okay, so, and you know, they're trained to be like, this is what they're telling me. This is how I learned to read them based on body language, the sounds, and the way that their voice is responding. And so, although it's sort of annoying when they're there, sometimes it's just like them doing their jobs. Other times I think the cop takes it too far when he follows Mariom. But I will say that they allow us to have a break as an audience member on, wow, okay, there's something up, and the cop's going to be the one to get down and dirty and figure out what that is, because they're like, something's off. And they're literally trained to figure out, who is this person really? And then later we see that again with I don't know if it's a psychiatrist or a therapist, but when that person is speaking to Norman, who is in the assumed personality of Mother. So that's super interesting, and that's going on a lot in the film. That's why I feel like it should be a theme, a topic to talk about. And so, again, we see character breaks more in action and in the voiceovers of their minds, and less when they're interacting with other characters, because it's something that human beings do. They're rarely ever honest with other people unless they're alone, or they think they're not being heard, or they think no one's watching, and we see that in the film. So Norman's smirking as he sees the car of Marion's body sinking into that swamp in that muddy area. Mariom's smirking when she thinks about the man who paid the $40,000 for his daughter's house, finding out that it's no longer there. Norman turning the nice, awkward guy act off and on. Usually you hear it with the voiceover, or his smirks as well, or how he gets super defensive. Never getting a glimpse of the mother's face is a red flag until the big reveal and we find out why it was so ambiguous all the time. You know, lots of red flags, lots of red flags. And then I'm going to start and go into my favorite scenes and shots, but I do want to say that basically in the second half of the film, after Mariom is killed, there's a detective that meets up with Lila, who is the sister of Mariom, who comes back from some vacation or whatever thing she had going on. She can't find her sister. She hears news that her sister stole his $40,000. She goes to Sam, who is the lover of Mariom, and she's like, where's my sister? She can do whatever she wants. I don't know what you guys have planned. I'm assuming you're in on it, but you need to tell me where she is. She should tell me where she is so I'm not worried, because clearly she's worried. Sam has no idea what Lila's talking about. and they're trying to figure that out. There's a detective who's trying to figure it out. He goes snooping at Bates Motel. He gets a little too snoopy, asking questions that are making Norman very defensive and look very suspicious. He thinks that Mother is alive because Norman has made it clear that his mother is alive, so he sneaks into the house. This is the detective that sneaks into the house, and he gets killed by Mother, who is actually Norman. And then they don't hear from this detective who said he would meet with them within the hour. That's a super major red flag. Lila and Sam go to the sheriff of the town. He doesn't really see any real proof of anything. He thinks that Lila is just trying to protect her sister at all cost, which is kind of reasonable, but also, come on. He does end up talking to Norman. I don't know if he talks to him on the phone or not, but he doesn't suspect anything even after that. Lila's not satisfied, and neither is Sam. They end up going and posing as a married couple, and they go to Bates Motel, and they give the whole spiel to Norman that they're a married couple, whatever. He places them in one of the rooms that I think he has a peephole in. And so I think pretty quickly they have gauged that they're both lying to each other. Sam distracts Norman. Lila goes up to the house to try to find Mother. And what she really finds is a dead body right before Norman runs in dressed up as Mother. And this time the audience physically sees this, right? We can see that it is Norman after all these times that people have been getting killed. And it's just been a wig, or it's been too dark and we've just seen a shadow. Now we can see that Norman is Mother, thus Norman is the killer. Anything that you suspected of him being iffy is now confirmed that he is super sketch. And he goes and he tries to kill Lila, but Sam grabs Norman before he can kill Lila. And I think before this, when Sam was trying to distract Norman and Norman realized that he didn't know where Lila was and he suspected she was up in the house, he knocked Sam out with something, and I guess Sam came back from that after being unconscious for a little bit. And ultimately, Norman gets locked up. He's in this cell. He's now completely Mother. Mother is a voiceover in the head, and he has assumed the personality of Mother. He's admitted to everything. I don't know if when he was talking to the psychiatrist about everything, if he was in the voice of Norman and whatever, but they know everything now. They know where to find everything. And the psychiatrist slash therapist, because I don't know what they're defined as or their title is, goes back into the room and explains to Sam and Lila and everyone what happened. And confirms the deaths of the people that were there, that Mother's not real, that Norman is Mother. He's the killer. And it's such a great reveal. That's the conclusion of the film. So my favorite scenes from the film is the iconic shower scene, the use of the shadows as this overwhelming presence of power of Mother and the knife over Mariom, the music enhancing the violence and fear, quick, sharp movements, and not really being too graphic, but definitely getting the point across, which I think is really hard to do. The extended fear of someone harming you at your most vulnerable. I mean, she was literally naked in the middle of nowhere in her shower. So that's really scary. And she was alone. And then the feeling of the film having two distinctive parts in a way that's cohesive and entertaining. Mariam's journey and perspective was really interesting, but then we go to the next section where her sister Lila's journey to find her is the next sort of extension of the first half of the film. And I personally feel like it does feel distinct enough that the film shifts, but not in a way that feels like it's not cohesive. It's definitely cohesive. Watching Norman get caught up in his lies as more people arrive asking questions is the cherry on top of all that. So it's really, that's another sort of choice that the film makes, Hitchcock makes, that I really enjoyed. So another scene that was great was the detective falling down the stairs after being stabbed by Norman or Mother. The way that the killing scenes are not too graphic, which I said before, or loud, although I think there's a yelp or a yell or a slight scream in some of them, but you still feel the fear, the mystery, the warning of sometimes of things going wrong. Usually because they're creeping and, they're not supposed to be in there, but obviously the music being used as a way to create an emotion for the audience, which happens a lot in older films. I don't think it happens as much now, but it's still being a thing that's used. Music is a really good tool for emotion. Okay, and then the sister discovering the body of mother and Norman being completely caught in his own web. The entire sequence leading up to that final climactic scene and the conclusion is excellent. And it's almost goofy in the way that Norman sort of gets caught and odd, but it's so damn good. And then the few seconds of seeing the car being pulled out of the swamp/mud after seeing Norman's creepy little smirk when he's in that cell and he's assumed the full personality of Mother is really dark. And, you see this is the after effect of the cops going there and pulling the car and obviously going to find Mariom. It's wild. It's really wild. Okay, so my final closing thoughts or conclusion is the state of the mind. Why is it so powerful? Everything being confirmed by the psychiatrist/therapist. Who is Norman Bates? And who does he appear to be to others? The dominant personality has won, which is a quote that the psychiatrist used. And yeah, I just think the ultimate thing about this is the mind is such a powerful thing. But what happens when it's so powerful that it starts to harm others in a very negative, deadly way? This is a quote between Marion and Norman. Do you go out with friends? Norman. Well, a boy's best friend is his mother. And this is Milton. We're always quickest to doubt people who have a reputation for being honest. And then I'm going to read the voiceover of Mother's voice as Norman is in police custody in sort of this little, I guess you could call it interviewing or interrogation room. And I'm just going to read sort of the last part that's really, really good. And I'll probably even add a little tiny snippet at the end of this video just so you can hear it too, and the eeriness of the mother's voice. I'll just sit here and be quiet, just in case they do suspect me. They're probably watching me. Well, let them. Let them see what kind of person I am. I'm not even going to swat that fly. I hope they are watching. They'll see. They'll see and they'll know, and they'll say why. She wouldn't even harm a fly. Thanks. Bye.
I hope they are watching.